Почему?
My name is Georgia, and I'm 57 years old. Today was supposed to be perfect. I had spent the entire afternoon wrapping the beautiful diamond necklace I bought for my daughter Sarah's 5th wedding anniversary celebration. The excitement in my chest felt like butterflies as I imagined her face lighting up when she opened it. After 5 years of what I thought was building a wonderful relationship with my son-in-law Marcus, I believed tonight would be another milestone in our growing family bond. But sometimes life has a way of showing you exactly where you stand in someone's world. Before we dive into what happened that changed everything, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button if you've ever felt unappreciated by family, and don't forget to subscribe because trust me, this story has a twist that will leave you speechless. Let me take you back to where this all began, because understanding my relationship with my daughter will help you see why what happened hurt so deeply. I became a widow 5 years ago when my husband Tom died suddenly of a heart attack. He was only 55, and losing him left me devastated, but also determined to rebuild my life. I channeled my grief into my real estate career, working longer hours and closing bigger deals. The success helped fill the empty spaces in my days, but nothing could fill the void in my heart except for my relationship with Sarah. Sarah had always been my pride and joy. As my only child, she and I shared everything. We talked every day, went shopping together on weekends, and she often said I was more like her best friend than her mother. When she was going through her divorce from her first husband, I was there every step of the way, helping her rebuild her confidence and start fresh. Then, 3 years ago, she met Marcus at a coffee shop downtown. He was charming, successful in finance, and seemed genuinely interested in making Sarah happy. When she first brought him to meet me, I was thrilled. Here was a man who could provide the stability and love my daughter deserved after her painful first marriage. But from the very beginning, something felt off about Marcus. He was polite enough during our initial meeting, shaking my hand firmly and calling me Mrs. Patterson. Yet, there was something in his eyes, a coolness that made me feel like I was being evaluated rather than welcomed. When Sarah excused herself to get dessert from the kitchen, Marcus leaned back in his chair and said, "Sarah's told me so much about how close you two are. That's really special." The words were right, but his tone suggested he found our closeness more concerning than special. As their relationship progressed, I noticed small changes in Sarah. Our daily phone calls became every other day, then twice a week. When I'd suggest lunch dates, she'd often say Marcus had already made plans for them. I told myself it was natural for a woman in love to want to spend time with her boyfriend, but deep down I sensed I was slowly being edged out of her life. The real shift came when they decided to buy a house together after just 6 months of dating. Sarah came to me with tears in her eyes, explaining that they'd found the perfect place but couldn't qualify for the mortgage they needed. Without hesitation, I offered to help. I used my excellent credit to secure the loan and committed to making the monthly payments of $3,000 until they could refinance in their own names. Marcus's reaction when Sarah told him about my offer was telling. Instead of gratitude, he seemed almost annoyed. "I don't want to be indebted to anyone," he said during dinner at their new place. "But I suppose if it's the only way to get our own place, we'll have to accept it temporarily." Temporarily? That word stung more than I let on. Over the next 2 years, the signs of growing tension became impossible to ignore, though I kept making excuses for behaviour that should have raised red flags much earlier. The first major incident happened during Thanksgiving. I had been invited, of course, but when I arrived with my famous sweet potato casserole and homemade cranberry sauce, I found the dining room table set for 8 people, with me relegated to a small card table in the corner of the living room. Marcus explained that the main table was for his college friends and their spouses. Sarah gave me an apologetic look but said nothing to defend the seating arrangement. I ate my meal alone while listening to laughter from the other room, feeling more like hired help than family. When I finally got up to leave, Marcus walked me to the door and said, "Thanks for understanding, Georgia. We're trying to build our own traditions now, you know." The dismissive way he said it made my stomach turn, but I smiled and nodded because I didn't want to cause problems for Sarah. Then came Sarah's 29th birthday last spring. I had been planning a surprise party for weeks, calling her friends and coordinating with Marcus about the guest list. 2 days before the party, Sarah casually mentioned that Marcus was taking her to Napa Valley for the weekend. When I asked about the party, she looked confused and said, "What party? Marcus didn't mention anything about a party." I had to call 15 people to cancel, throwing away $200 worth of decorations and a custom cake. When I confronted Marcus about it later, he shrugged and said, "I thought it would be better if we celebrated as a couple this year. She's a grown woman, not a little girl, who needs mummy planning her parties." The hits kept coming. I learned about their housewarming party through a photo Sarah posted on Facebook, showing a house full of people I'd never met. When I ran into Sarah at the grocery store a few weeks later, she was with 2 women she introduced as her new friends from Marcus's work. The way she hesitated before introducing me as my mum made my heart sink. Every interaction felt calculated to remind me that I was becoming an outsider in my own daughter's life. Marcus would make comments about how important it was for married couples to be independent and not rely on outside interference. He'd talk about how his parents lived across the country and respected their privacy by visiting only once a year. I started questioning everything. Had I been too involved in Sarah's life? Was I being the overbearing mother-in-law every man feared? But then I'd remember all the years Sarah and I had been each other's closest confidants, how she used to call me when she was scared or excited or just needed to hear a familiar voice. The worst part was watching Sarah change. My vibrant, opinionated daughter began deferring to Marcus on everything. When we'd have lunch, she'd check her phone constantly as if she needed his permission to enjoy our time together. She stopped sharing details about her life, giving vague responses when I asked about work or their plans. I tried talking to her directly about it once. "Honey, I feel like we're not as close as we used to be," I said during one of our increasingly rare coffee dates. She looked down at her hands and said, "Things are just different now, Mum. I'm married and building my own family. That's normal, right?" Normal. That word echoed in my head for weeks. Was this normal, or was I losing my daughter to a man who saw me as competition for her loyalty? When Sarah first mentioned the idea of celebrating their 5th wedding anniversary with a party at home, I felt a spark of hope that maybe our relationship could return to what it once was. It was mid-March when she called with the news. Marcus and I were thinking about having people over for our anniversary in April. She said, her voice carrying more enthusiasm than I'd heard in months. Nothing too fancy, just close friends and family for dinner and dancing in the backyard. My heart leaped at being included in the family category. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. What can I do to help?" I asked, already mentally planning how I could contribute to making their celebration special. There was a pause before she answered. "Well, I guess we could use some help with flowers or something. Marcus wants to keep it simple, though." Simple. That should have been my first clue that my involvement wouldn't be as welcome as I hoped, but I was so grateful to be included that I brushed aside the lukewarm response. Over the next 2 weeks, I threw myself into preparation with the enthusiasm of a woman trying to rebuild a bridge to her daughter. I visited 3 different florists before finding the perfect arrangement: white orchids mixed with baby's breath and eucalyptus, elegant but not overwhelming. The cost was $400, but I didn't hesitate. Next, I contacted the best bakery in town and ordered a custom 3-layer cake with cream cheese frosting and fresh berries. When the baker asked about the design, I described something that would reflect both Sarah's love of vintage elegance and Marcus's more modern taste. Another $300, but seeing my daughter's face light up would be worth every penny. But the real surprise was the necklace. I had noticed Sarah admiring a diamond pendant in a jewelry store window during one of our recent outings. She'd lingered there for several minutes, commenting on how beautiful it was before reluctantly walking away. The next day, I returned to the store and spent 2 hours with the jeweler selecting a similar piece with a slightly larger diamond and a more intricate white gold chain. $2,200 was more than I'd ever spent on a single gift, but this felt like an investment in repairing our relationship. As the party date approached, my phone calls to Sarah became more frequent. I wanted to coordinate the timing of my arrival, discuss the menu, and make sure the flowers would complement whatever decorations they'd chosen. But each conversation felt strained, with Sarah giving short answers, and often saying she needed to check with Marcus about details. "Mum, you don't need to worry about all this," she said during one call. "We've got everything under control." But I could hear uncertainty in her voice, and I pressed on. "I just want everything to be perfect for you both. This is such a special milestone." Marcus's voice in the background was muffled, but I caught the words "too much" and "overwhelming." Sarah's response was quick. "Marcus says thank you for thinking of us, but we don't want you to go overboard." Go overboard! The phrase stung, but I convinced myself he was just trying to be considerate, not wanting me to spend too much money or effort. I was wrong. The night before the party, I laid out my best dress, a navy blue cocktail dress I'd worn to a charity gala the previous year. I polished my jewellery, wrapped the necklace in beautiful paper with a silver bow, and arranged the flowers in my car so they wouldn't get damaged during the drive. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt genuinely excited for the first time in months. Tomorrow would be a new beginning, a chance to show Marcus that I could be a positive part of their marriage rather than an intrusion. I fell asleep imagining Sarah's joy when she opened the necklace, and Marcus's surprise at how perfectly the flowers complemented their celebration. I had no idea I was preparing for the most humiliating night of my life. The Saturday evening arrived with perfect spring weather, and I felt a sense of anticipation I hadn't experienced in years as I drove through the familiar neighbourhood towards Sarah and Marcus's house. I had taken extra care with my appearance, styling my hair in soft waves and choosing earrings that would complement the navy dress without competing with the necklace I planned to give Sarah. The flowers sat securely in a crystal vase in my passenger seat, and the wrapped jewellery box was tucked safely in my purse. As I turned onto their street, I could see that the party was already in full swing. Cars lined both sides of the road, and warm light spilled from the windows of their colonial-style home. The sound of laughter and music drifted across the yard, and I smiled thinking about how happy Sarah must be celebrating with all their friends. I parked 3 houses down and carefully lifted the flower arrangement from my car. The orchids had stayed perfect during the drive, their white petals catching the light from the street lamps. Walking up the front path, I could see through the living room windows that the house was packed with people, all dressed in cocktail attire and holding wine glasses. My heart was beating with excitement as I rang the doorbell. I could hardly wait to see Sarah's face when she saw the flowers, and I was already planning when, during the evening, would be the perfect moment to present the necklace. The door opened, and Sarah appeared, wearing a stunning black dress I'd never seen before. For a moment, her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Mum, you look beautiful," she said, but I noticed she didn't immediately invite me in. "These are for you and Marcus," I said, holding out the orchid arrangement. "I thought they'd be perfect for your special celebration." Sarah took the flowers with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "They're gorgeous, thank you so much." But instead of stepping aside to let me enter, she remained in the doorway. That's when Marcus appeared behind her, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. His face carried an expression I'd seen before, but never directed at me with such open hostility. He was wearing a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, and he looked every inch the successful finance professional he was, except for the coldness in his eyes. "Georgia," he said, not moving to shake my hand or welcome me inside. I think there's been some confusion here. The music and conversation continued behind them, but I felt like the sound was coming from underwater. Confusion, I asked, clutching my purse tighter. Marcus stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Sarah and me. I thought we'd made it clear that tonight's celebration was going to be intimate, just close friends. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my composure. I understood this was a family celebration for your anniversary, I said carefully. That's when Marcus said the words that would replay in my mind for months afterward. He raised his voice slightly, ensuring that anyone in the nearby living room could hear him clearly. Georgia, I thought we'd discussed this. You're not invited tonight. This is a party for our friends, our generation. We wanted an evening without having to entertain older relatives. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see faces in the living room turning toward the front door, people craning their necks to witness what was clearly becoming an uncomfortable scene. Sarah's face had gone completely pale, but she said nothing to contradict her husband. Marcus continued his voice, carrying that tone of patient explanation adults use with children who aren't understanding a simple concept. I'm sure you understand. Sarah and I need space to celebrate with people who share our interests and energy level. Having family here would just change the whole dynamic of the evening. I looked past him to my daughter, hoping she would say something, anything to soften the blow or invite me in, despite her husband's objections. But Sarah avoided my eyes, staring down at the flowers in her hands, as if they held the answers to questions she was afraid to ask. The humiliation was complete and public. At least a dozen people had witnessed my son-in-law essentially telling me I was too old and irrelevant to attend my own daughter's anniversary celebration. I could feel their stares burning into my back, and I knew this moment would become a story they'd tell at future gatherings. With every ounce of dignity I could muster, I reached into my purse and pulled out the beautifully wrapped jewelry box. I set it gently on the small table beside the door. This is for you, Sarah, I said quietly. Happy anniversary. Then I turned and walked back down the path to my car, my head held high despite the tears that threatened to spill over. Behind me, I heard the door close and the party continue as if nothing had happened. As I drove home through the darkness, the full weight of what had just occurred began to settle over me. This wasn't just about being excluded from one party. This was about being systematically removed from my daughter's life by a man who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, my sadness had begun transforming into something much more powerful. A determination that I would never again allow anyone to treat me with such blatant disrespect. I sat in my car for several minutes after arriving home, letting the engine tick as it cooled and staring at the darkened windows of my empty house. The humiliation was still fresh, but underneath it, a different feeling was beginning to emerge. It wasn't anger exactly, but something colder and more calculating. Inside, I didn't bother turning on the lights. I walked through my living room in the darkness and sat in Tom's old leather chair, the one I'd kept positioned exactly where he'd always liked it, facing the window that looked out onto our garden. For the first time since his death, I felt his presence strongly, and I knew exactly what he would say about what had just happened. Tom had always been protective of my dignity. During our 25 years together, he'd never once allowed anyone to speak to me with disrespect, whether it was a rude salesperson or a difficult neighbor. Georgia, he used to say, you teach people how to treat you by what you accept. Tonight, I had accepted the unacceptable for far too long. I reached for the lamp beside the chair and finally brought light to the room. On the coffee table sat a neat stack of financial documents I'd been reviewing earlier in the week, preparing for tax season. Among them were the mortgage statements for Sarah and Marcus's house, showing 3 years of payments totaling over $108,000. $108,000. The number seemed surreal as I looked at it in black and white. That money represented countless hours of work, dozens of real estate transactions, and careful budgeting on my part to ensure I could cover both my own expenses and their mortgage payment every month. I pulled out my calculator and began adding up other expenses I'd covered for them over the years. The down payment assistance, $15,000. The wedding gift, $5,000. The new appliances, when their old ones broke, $3,500. Christmas and birthday gifts. Emergency car repairs, the security deposit, when they'd needed to move apartments before buying the house. The total was staggering over $130,000 I'd contributed to their life together, and tonight I had been told I wasn't worthy of sharing in their celebration because I was too old to fit into their social circle. I thought about Sarah's face at the door, how she'd looked down at the flowers instead of standing up to her husband's cruelty. This was the daughter I'd raised to be strong and independent, who I'd taught to speak up for herself and others. Where was that woman tonight, when her own mother was being publicly humiliated? The anger I'd been holding back finally surfaced, not as an explosive rage, but as a cold, clear determination. I would not continue enabling people who had no respect for me. I would not continue sacrificing my financial security and emotional well-being for individuals who saw my generosity as an entitlement rather than a gift. I walked to my home office and pulled out the folder containing all the banking information for the automatic mortgage payments. The account was set up in my name with my authorization required for any changes. Sarah and Marcus had never asked to take over the payments themselves, and I had never insisted they should, believing that helping them was an expression of my love for my daughter. At 11:30 p.m., I called the bank's 24-hour customer service line. The representative who answered was professional and efficient, walking me through the process of cancelling the automatic payment authorization. It took less than 10 minutes to complete. "Just to confirm, Mrs. Patterson," the representative said, "the automatic payment scheduled for the 1st of next month has been cancelled and no future payments will be deducted from your account without new authorization from you personally." "That's correct," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Is there anything else I can help you with tonight?" "No, that takes care of everything. Thank you for your assistance." After hanging up, I sat in the silence of my office and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete freedom from obligation to people who didn't value what I brought to their lives. For the first time since Tom's death, I was making a decision based entirely on my own worth and dignity rather than on my fear of losing people who had already chosen to push me away. I knew that tomorrow would bring consequences, but tonight I felt lighter than I had in months. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is to stop enabling them to take advantage of your kindness. As I prepared for bed, I realized I was actually looking forward to the conversation that would inevitably come. It was time for some truths to be spoken, and I was finally ready to speak them. Sunday morning arrived with unusually bright sunshine streaming through my bedroom windows, and I woke feeling more rested than I had in weeks. For a few moments, I lay in bed enjoying the peaceful quiet before remembering the events of the previous night and the phone call I'd made to the bank. I was finishing my second cup of coffee and reading the newspaper when my phone rang at exactly 8:15 a.m. Sarah's name appeared on the caller ID, and I let it ring 3 times before answering with a calm, "Good morning, sweetheart." "Mum, we need to talk." Sarah's voice was strained, higher pitched than usual. "Can you come over? Like right now?" "I'm having a lovely quiet morning," I replied, turning a page of the newspaper. "What did you need to discuss?" "The mortgage payment didn't go through. The bank called Marcus this morning and said the automatic payment was cancelled. There has to be some kind of mistake." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "There's no mistake, Sarah. I cancelled the authorization last night." The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Sarah finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You did what?" I called the bank and cancelled the automatic payment arrangement. The mortgage is now your responsibility, just as it should have been from the beginning. Mum, you can't just do that without warning us. We don't have $3,000 sitting around. Our budget is based on you covering the mortgage. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on me. Your budget was based on my generosity, which you and Marcus made very clear last night is no longer welcome in your lives. That's not what happened. Marcus was just trying to keep the party small and intimate. Sarah, your husband, told me in front of a room full of people that I wasn't invited because I was too old to fit in with your friends. He said you needed space to celebrate without having to entertain older relatives. Those were his exact words. Another long pause. He didn't mean it like that. How exactly did he mean it? Because from where I was standing, it sounded very much like he meant that I'm not important enough to include in your life celebrations, but I'm useful enough to pay for the house where you hold them. I could hear muffled voices in the background, and I knew Marcus had joined the conversation. Sarah's voice became more urgent. Look, maybe we can all sit down and talk about this like adults. Marcus wants to apologize for any misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding, honey. There was a very clear message delivered in a very public way. I heard it, your guests heard it, and I suspect you heard it too, even if you weren't brave enough to respond to it. That's not fair, Mum. You're putting me in an impossible position. No, Sarah, you and Marcus put you in an impossible position when you decided my money was more important than my dignity. I'm simply removing myself from that equation. The background voices became more heated, and suddenly Marcus's voice came on the line. Georgia, this is ridiculous. You can't just cut off financial support because your feelings got hurt at a party. His dismissive tone sparked something fierce in my chest. Marcus, let me be very clear about something. I have spent over $130,000 supporting your lifestyle over the past 3 years. I did this out of love for my daughter and hope that we could build a family relationship together. Last night, you made it crystal clear that I am not family to you. I'm just a source of funding. You're being dramatic and manipulative. I'm being honest and decisive. If I'm too old and irrelevant to celebrate your successes, then I'm certainly too old and irrelevant to subsidize them. Look, I'm sorry if you misunderstood what I said last night. I was trying to keep the guest list manageable, not exclude you personally. Marcus, you looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't invited because you didn't want to entertain older relatives. You said this in front of people who are now going home with stories about how my own son-in-law publicly dismissed me. There's no misunderstanding that. Sarah's voice came back on the line, tearful now. Mom, please, can we just figure this out? We'll lose the house if we can't make the payment. Then I suggest you and Marcus figure out how to make the payment yourselves. You're both educated adults with good jobs. It's time to take responsibility for your own financial obligations. We can't afford it on our income alone, you know that. Then perhaps you should have thought about that before deciding I wasn't important enough to include in your lives. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Sarah alternating between tears and anger and Marcus becoming increasingly hostile as he realized I wasn't going to back down. Finally, I ended the call with a simple statement. When you're ready to have a genuine conversation about respect and boundaries, I'll be here. Until then, you have 30 days to figure out your housing situation. 2 hours later, Marcus showed up at my front door unannounced, clearly believing he could intimidate me into changing my mind. I watched through the peephole as he paced on my porch for several minutes before ringing the doorbell. When I opened the door, his face was flushed with anger. We need to settle this right now, Georgia. What you're doing is vindictive and cruel. I stood in my doorway, but didn't invite him in. What I'm doing is protecting my own dignity and financial future, something I should have done a long time ago. You're going to destroy Sarah's life over one comment at a party. Marcus, I'm not destroying anything. I'm simply no longer subsidizing a relationship where I'm clearly not welcome or respected. He spent the next 15 minutes trying various approaches, guilt, anger, veiled threats about never seeing future grandchildren, and finally desperate pleading. None of it moved me because I had finally reached the point where my own self-worth mattered more than other people's comfort. When he left, I knew the real battle was just beginning, but I also knew I was finally fighting for the right thing, my own dignity. 3 months passed before Sarah contacted me again, and during that time, I discovered what life could be like when I prioritized my own well-being instead of trying to maintain relationships with people who didn't value me. The immediate aftermath had been painful. I spent many evenings wondering if I'd been too harsh, if there might have been another way to handle the situation. But each time I questioned my decision, I remembered the feeling of standing on that doorstep while Marcus publicly dismissed me, and my resolve strengthened. I used the $3,000 I'd been spending monthly on their mortgage to renovate my guest bathroom and take a 2-week cruise to Alaska I'd been postponing for years. I joined a book club at the local library, started taking pottery classes, and volunteered at a literacy program downtown. For the first time since Tom's death, I was building a life based on my own interests rather than trying to insert myself into someone else's. The other women in my book club turned out to be a revelation. Most of them were my age or older, and many had similar stories about adult children who took their support for granted while keeping them at arm's length emotionally. Margaret, a retired teacher whose son lived across the country, became a particularly close friend. She'd learned years earlier to build her own fulfilling life instead of waiting for her children to provide her happiness. The hardest lesson I ever learned, Margaret told me one afternoon over tea, was that loving someone doesn't mean accepting poor treatment from them. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable their bad behavior. During those 3 months, I heard through mutual friends that Sarah and Marcus were struggling financially. They'd had to take out a personal loan at a high interest rate to cover the first mortgage payment, and Marcus had picked up weekend consulting work to try to make ends meet. Part of me felt guilty about their difficulties, but a larger part recognized that this was exactly the wake-up call they needed. Then, on a Tuesday evening in July, Sarah called. Not the panicked, angry Sarah from 3 months earlier, but my daughter speaking in the voice I remembered from before Marcus had changed our relationship. "Mum, could I come over? I'd like to talk if you're willing." "Of course, sweetheart. Would you like me to make dinner?" "That would be nice. And Mum, Marcus won't be coming with me. This conversation needs to be just between us." When Sarah arrived an hour later, she looked different somehow. Thinner, more serious, but also more like the strong woman I'd raised her to be. We sat in my kitchen while I prepared her favourite meal, grilled chicken with roasted vegetables and garlic mashed potatoes. "I owe you an apology," she began without preamble, "not just for what happened at the party, but for everything that led up to it." I continued cooking, giving her space to say what she needed to say. "I've been thinking about that night for months, and I finally understand what really happened. Marcus didn't just exclude you from a party, he publicly humiliated you, and I stood there and let it happen because I was afraid of confronting him." "Why were you afraid?" I asked gently. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Because I'd gotten used to letting him make decisions about our social life, our finances, our relationships. It felt easier to go along with what he wanted than to rock the boat. But watching you walk away that night, seeing the dignity you maintained even when you were being treated terribly, I realized I'd lost something important about myself." We talked through dinner and late into the evening. Sarah explained how Marcus had gradually convinced her that my involvement in their lives was unhealthy, that a strong marriage required cutting ties with anyone who might interfere with their unity. She'd accepted his perspective because she loved him and wanted their marriage to work, but she'd slowly realized that isolating her from people who loved her wasn't building strength in their relationship, it was building his control over her life. "The money was never really about the money, was it?" she asked as we cleared the dinner dishes. "No, honey, it was about respect and inclusion. I would have gladly continued helping you financially if I'd felt valued as part of your family, but I couldn't continue supporting people who saw me as a burden to be managed. Sarah nodded, tears running down her cheeks. I want to fix this, Mum. I want us to have a real relationship again, and I want Marcus to understand that treating you badly isn't acceptable to me. What does Marcus think about you being here tonight? He's not happy about it, but that's his problem to deal with. I've started standing up to him when he's wrong, and he doesn't like it. He's going to have to learn that I won't choose between him and having other important relationships in my life. Over the following weeks, Sarah and I began rebuilding our connections slowly and carefully. She came for dinner every Tuesday, and we started taking weekend trips together again. More importantly, she began requiring Marcus to treat me with respect. It took 2 more months before Marcus finally swallowed his pride enough to apologize directly. He came to my house on a Saturday afternoon alone and spent an hour acknowledging that his behavior had been wrong and asking for a chance to start over. His apology wasn't perfect, and I could tell it was motivated more by financial pressure than genuine remorse, but it was a beginning. I agreed to resume helping with part of their mortgage payment, but not the full amount, and only after they'd demonstrated consistent, respectful behaviour over several months. The most important change wasn't in Marcus's attitude, though that did improve significantly. The most important change was in Sarah, who had rediscovered her own voice and her own strength. She'd learned that love doesn't require sacrificing your other relationships, and that a marriage built on isolation and control isn't a marriage worth preserving. As for me, I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is refuse to enable their disrespect. Setting boundaries isn't cruel. It's necessary for healthy relationships, and sometimes losing something you thought you couldn't live without teaches you just how strong you really are. The evening I'd walked away from that party, feeling humiliated and worthless, had actually been the beginning of reclaiming my own dignity and teaching my daughter to do the same. Sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the consequences of their own choices, because that's where real growth begins. Standing up for myself didn't just save my relationship with Sarah, it showed her how to stand up for herself too. And that lesson turned out to be worth far more than any amount of money I could have continued paying to keep the peace. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity? What would you have done in my place when faced with such public humiliation from family? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about finding strength in difficult family situations. Share this with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to set boundaries, even with people you love. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your worth isn't determined by how much others appreciate your sacrifices, but by how much you value yourself. Until next time, take care of yourselves and don't let anyone convince you that love means accepting disrespect.